Hey, you're listening to AJ Pickett. This is my podcasty thing, and this week, I've been asked to talk about both non-monster elements that get added into encounters, and also I wanted to address something about character resources and why the CR system is just one part of what makes Dungeons & Dragons a gaming system and not just a storytelling medium. So terrain and stuff is very interesting. This is non-monster encounters. It comes down to what's in a town, whether you're encountering something in a hovel or a house or a shop or a manor or an estate villa or a keep or a tower or a fort or a castle or a citadel. What are these things? What differentiates them? What makes it a fortification? Why is it a dungeon and not a sewer? Why is it a light forest or a dense forest or just broken ground or grasslands or mountains or swamps or deserts or coastlines or shallows in the sea or deep water or caverns? Dungeons, ruins, surface ruins or submerged ruins or a dungeon ruin or even a broken mix of all of the above. These all make for interesting points about what differentiates the terrain and what makes it an interesting element. So a broken ground could be grasslands with large boulders in it. It could be chunks of ruins from long ago that doesn't actually classify as ruins because it doesn't have any cohesive shape anymore. It's just bits and pieces of stone from something that was once there. But it may hint to there being a structure underground which is still intact. So these things are things that you keep in mind when you're describing the terrain and stuff. So the specific elements of a town could be how close together the buildings are, or whether the buildings are typically over the first story or even third story, or whether they even arch overhead and connect, like the alleyways actually shelter you from the rain, but it's closed in and filthy because it's hard to clean out such tight-fitting places. Whether the people in the town have a habit of walking and talking very close together, or whether they spread out. I know it's particularly infuriating, for instance, to have to walk behind a big bunch of people who are walking slower than you, particularly when you've got somewhere to go, and whether pushing past them may be seen as some sort of deadly affront to their local mores and customs. So something to keep in mind. If you're in a light forest or a dense forest, it can change things dramatically, particularly in the way that predators will hunt you. It's hard to get ambushed in a light forest, but creatures may stick close to the ground in the underbrush instead of sticking to the arches and canopy of trees, for instance. So things like that. Open grasslands have their own difficulties. So you may have settlements which are in shallows, so they can't be seen from a distance. So they will keep everything close to the ground and live in tents and yurts and things like that. They may even dig underground to take advantage of not being seen on the largely flat ground. So you may have settlements which are actually hollowed out, dugouts and things like that. In the mountains, of course, it's all about shelter and warmth, and also not being too inviting a target for things which see any sort of cavern or cave as an inviting thing to take over themselves. So dwarves, for instance, will dig quite far into rock to make sure that dragons can't get easy access. We've seen the result of that in Lord of the Rings. Hazards and things and encounters, of course, is what the topic of today's podcasty thing is about. And really it comes down to either it's a delay that causes something to be more difficult than it would ordinarily be. I think it's very important that there's very few encounters which are going to be interesting with it's just you, your characters, and a monster in an open sort of unmarked space. A gladiatorial arena, of course, is something like that, but even gladiatorial arenas were sometimes more interesting because they had the ability to flood the arena, or they would have a fight going on with wild animals chained up around the outside. So if you got pushed too far towards the edge, you didn't find yourself in the claws of a lion. So, and things like you can have assistance with an action cost, for instance. So there could be something in the encounter which is going to help and facilitate either side, but it's going to cost them some actions to activate it. And that's actions that they can't be damaging or hindering their opponent while they're doing this. So the opponent basically has a free shot at them, but of course the payoff is that they could win the fight outright. Things in the environment that can harm them, that can actually do damage. There are only so many types of damage that exist within the game. So we've got, what have we got? We've got acid, bludgeoning, cold, fire, force damage, lightning, necrotic damage, piercing, poison, psychic, radiant, slashing, and thunder damage. Those are all of the damage types that you have available to play with in the rules, and it really covers everything. So it's not that complicated when it comes down to damage and things. However, it can get very complicated when it comes to things which cause ongoing loss. In Dungeons & Dragons, the basic premise is you've got a counter to the resources of 4 or 5 adventurers. In their day of activities, they're only supposed to have like 2 short rests, but have something like 5 or 6 different combat encounters or things that take their resources away by one way or another. Most beginner DMs will just assume that means combat encounters, but of hazard encounters and difficulties and diversions and things that lengthen their journey also count towards taking away their resources. One of the most important resources they have is time. The other they have is mobility. So something to bear in mind. But of course, in the actual gameplay that I've seen in 5th edition, most adventuring groups will take short rests after almost every single combat, and they'll take long rests even in the middle of the day, which is kind of crazy, but there it is. So the system makes these assumptions about gameplay which don't really match up very well with what people will do in day-to-day adventuring. So I'm here to help. One of the things that you can do to seriously hamper an adventuring party is cause ability score loss. Now this is something that I don't take particularly lightly, and I'll explain to you why. Because there's a huge yawning gulf in the rules when it comes to how you handle ability score loss and what it actually means in the game. It used to be as common as mud for adventurers to lose ability points during the game and have their maximum hit points total reduced and have the ability to naturally heal stopped, for instance. But most people in the game don't even know what the rate of natural healing is for somebody if they don't have access to magic in the game. It's so commonplace for magical healing to take place in the game of Dungeons & Dragons. So the other thing we have is obstacles and blockages, as I mentioned, and diversions. Diversions are very, very important, both in story and in just how you handle terrain and encounters. Toxins and other damage that gets worse unless it's counteracted is also incredibly important. So this is a different way of handling poisons, or perhaps a way that you just haven't thought about before. A poison that gets progressively more deadly because it's eroding away at your character's defenses. It perhaps is causing ability score loss, or has the potential to cause permanent ability score loss. Acid damage, for instance, is literally burning away bits of your body. So why wouldn't you have ability score loss if you've got serious acid damage to your arms and upper body? It's going to cause dexterity and strength loss because you've actually burnt through tendons and muscles. This makes sense. It's not just hit points don't just represent your stamina, they also represent actual physical damage. But really, hit points restoration from healing potions and things shouldn't be able to heal everything that acid does to a body, right? Because if you have your arm chopped off, it's not as simple as just pouring some healing potion on it and you reattach your arm. So serious damage to your body, where you actually get reduced to 0 hit points, should probably entail some ability score loss as well, right? Well, let's get into that later. Managing round-by-round events as though they are also a monster. So they take place at initiative counts. Okay, so if you've got a cave-in or something like that, it may not happen all at once. It could be gradually happening. Or you could have a trap which is a rolling towards you sort of boulder or something like that, which causes you've got a split second where you can probably finish something that you're doing, and then you've got to get out of there because the consequences of that thing hitting you are going to be extremely severe. So all of a sudden it's a race against time, or it's a race against an inevitable, inexorable object, an irresistible force, as you will. So there's something. Or a quick thinking character to realize and put 2 and 2 together and say, okay, we can use some object that we passed by before to stop this in its tracks, but we have to get ahead of it in order to give ourselves enough time to do this. And if we don't have enough time to do it, or we fail to do it before time, we have to get out of there. So this could be shoring up a section of the dungeon to stop a cave-in in its tracks, for instance. Dungeons can be in motion. Now this is another interesting thing. I've seen lots of designs for dungeons where corridors and things move, clockwork sort of construction and things like that. One thing that I quite enjoy reading through is an old series of books called Grimtooth's Traps, where it revolved a lot around moving corridors and tilting floors and traps that don't appear to be what they are. You know, you grab hold of a rope and it's actually a trigger that causes something else to happen. And a lot of these infernal traps can be very, very vexing and extremely unfair to player characters because the players just don't know what's going to happen. But if you think about it, somebody who's designing a lair to trap humanoids would design them exactly like this. Essentially, it's a better mouse trap where the adventurer is the mouse. Storms can change the landscape. So a storm is not just bad weather that you have to get out of. It can also knock out bridges. It can collapse whole sections of a dungeon. It can cause significant damages to towns and things. It can cause roofs to collapse. Flooding can leave an area impassable for days. Floodwaters, of course, can be filled with debris. They can be filled with dangerous alchemical fluids from a ruined tower that fell down, for instance. They can have monsters that got loose and are now swirling around in the liquid somewhere. So it can be extremely dangerous to make your way through floodwaters. And of course, you could rescue people and things. It could be a matter of going into a region which has been devastated by some sort of a disaster or an ongoing disaster, such as a forest fire or a series of rumbling earthquakes that are caused by some ongoing effect, such as a Tarrasque attacking the town next door, which causes a continuous low rumbling earthquake, which is causing distable land to collapse farmland and arable land in a series of crevasses because there's dungeons built under the town which are now collapsing. Sinkholes, for instance, would be pretty common in a land where there's lots of dungeons underneath towns and things. You know, you get a flooded series of dungeon rooms built out of some sort of permeable rock, and they erode away, and then next thing you know, the king's castle built on top of this place is starting to fall apart because sinkholes are opening up underneath it. And of course, that's going to cause them a lot of time and expense to fix, and it could be potentially exacerbated by the town being under attack when this happens. Perhaps the fact that there's secret ruins underneath a city, or a citadel, for instance, where people live in a fortified area, the information that you could divert some water to flood an area to cause a sinkhole, to cause the fortifications to fall apart, could be a major, huge secret that is the one side or the other will go to any extent to get that information. So you can complicate things that way. Encounter objectives and goals are like modular character traits for a drama. What are the risks and what are the rewards of introducing these things? Think about what are the possible consequences of introducing a powerful artifact or object or terrain feature could be, and how it influences and changes things. So if a city or an adventure takes place in a large forest, who are the factions and things that live there? Forests are typically densely populated by animals and creatures and things. They can probably support quite a diverse range of different humanoid life as well. So how do they interact with each other? That sort of thing. Okay, so environmental encounters can involve quicksand, tar pits, brush fires, and wild magic outbreaks. As I mentioned, those sort of magical things could be quite common. In Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, magic gets used all the time, and we don't really think about the ongoing side effects at the periphery of all this magic use. It's disrupting nature, right? So what happens when there's a lot of adventuring going on in an area, or a magical conflict breaks out between two different groups? Those wizards are not going to think too much about the natural balance of things when they're having fireballs thrown at their friends. So they may be drawing on natural magics and disrupting natural flows in order to use concentrated powerful magic, which could cause outbreaks of wild magic or even null magic zones where the weave has just been completely collapsed or depleted, so to speak. Ancient portals can also cause problems and complications. Perhaps you could enter into a barrier which you cross through and half the adventuring party gets teleported 300 miles suddenly because they walked into a portal which the physical aspects of the portal are no longer there, but the magical aspect of the portal is still fully functioning or partially functioning, or could be set off randomly by the casting of a spell which has nothing to do with portals. It could be sort of frizzing with a broken circuit which may connect under random circumstances. Broken mythals are also an opportunity to introduce all sorts of weirdness. The elves established mythals to protect areas against things like Waterdeep, for instance. It's got a mythal which protects against the entry of dragons. Natural dragons into their city is highly restricted unless somebody has a specific object that bypasses that mythal's power. What sort of mythals could there be around cities and things which no longer even exist? So the forest may be overgrown over a ruin of some city. The people are long gone, magical items and things have been long plundered, but there's some magical effect that was placed over that area for a specific reason, which now seems completely wackadoodle and doesn't make any sense whatsoever. There can be hampering vegetations, like outbreaks of vines, some sort of sap from liquids, perfumes that can be intoxicating, spores which can cause all sorts of weird behavior or even act like a disease outbreak, thorns, even plants that make weird sounds, things like that. Freakish weather conditions like hail and tornado can be I don't think I've ever seen anybody use a tornado in a city or anything like that before, but it could be something that's both a major event which is happening right now, which the characters are called in to do something about. Maybe they've never seen a tornado before, it's a freakish weather condition, and they think there's something malicious or magical about it. I mean, if you've never seen a tornado before, it would look very much like a spell, would it not? Old mines at old mine fields or similar, so some sort of magical delayed effect which because of, I don't know, a battle which happened long ago in that particular place, a spell-like effect could be teleported forward in time or back in time. So maybe some conflict is going to break out in that city in the near future, and all of a sudden combatants from that particular battle suddenly show up in the town, desperate to get back to the fight and highly confused about what's going on and seeing everybody around them as a potential combatant. So that could be interesting. Trees falling over, roofs collapsing, caves-ins and pits and things. What if, for instance, you're making your way across a tar pit or around a tar pit and some undead horror comes crawling out of it, and just through natural, no fault of its own, some wizard casts a spell and it catches on fire. Now you've got a flaming tar pit monster that's rampaging around the place. Trees falling over, of course, can cause complications because there may be somebody living in that tree that's now looking to relocate, or the tree could have been grown over top of something. You know, the elves could have caused an undead army to be quashed underneath the roots of a forest which sprouted up under some amazing spell that they had, and now that the trees are being felled, undead spirits are being let loose. Old hunters may leave traps behind, nets, pits, nooses, snares, etc. So you may be making your way through a forest and just get caught up in a bear trap, just randomly. You know, you've walked across somebody's trap line. Something could have happened to the hunter. They could be long gone, or they could be coming round to check those traps again later on. So you may spend yourself a day in a tree, or they may be right on hand, about to come and check their traps straight away. There may be monsters which set traps. I mean, if you're an ambush type predator or you're an intelligent type predator, why not make traps that catch people? That's an interesting twist on things. You could encounter shrines to inhuman gods, say maybe a cursed shrine, for instance, or a shrine to some sort of an evil deity that forces you to make some sort of a sacrifice, or is designed to befuddle you or betwixt you or confuse you or send you in the wrong direction. Cliffs and epic trees and castle walls and platforms and floating stone and huge vines and hot air balloons, all of these things revolve around, you've got a limited form of locomotion from get from A to B, and if you mess it up, you're looking at a serious fall. That can be quite a stark thing. It's something that I don't introduce very often because falling damage is pretty nasty if it actually happens. There's no way to argue your way around falling 200 feet to your death, and it's kind of a sucky way to go if you're an adventurer. On top of huge animals is also some place you can set an adventure. If you're travelling on top of a dragon turtle, for instance, or it's some sort of really epically huge monster like a Tarrasque, or I quite like that idea. Or an air manta ray that you're flying around through, like the elemental plane of air, for instance. You could have a manta ray that's a mile across. or perhaps being chased by something even more terrifying. So you're trying to get this manta ray to go faster because you see the threat coming in before it does. You could have to deal with huge animals which are migrating through an area, so the town is actually at risk of a stampede, or the adventure itself could take place inside or on a stampede. So having a fight on top of moving animals is something I've always wanted to do. Of course, lava causes all sorts of problems with terrain. Is that bit of obsidian there safe to walk over, or is it going to crack under my weight and I'm going to get my foot melted off inside some liquid rock? It's, lava's both extremely hot, treacherous, and has the potential to explode. So it's probably one of the worst terrains you can possibly come up. And of course you'd have geysers of super hot steam and stuff which burst out of there, and of course noxious gases. So that's something to keep in mind. Waterfalls are something that people don't really take much appreciation of. There's a lot of historical evidence that people would hide things behind waterfalls, out of sight, and it's actually quite hard and treacherous to get close to a waterfall that's particularly powerful. There's a constant downdraft of air, the rocks leading up to it, if you're going through the water source to get there, the current is extremely strong, and the rocks are quite often very slippery and treacherous. And of course, once you lose your footing, you get pushed back by that flow of water very quickly. I've damn near broken some limbs doing that in my past as well. Climbing along a waterfall to get to an undercropping or overcropping or some sort of cavern that's dug underneath the waterfall can be very tricky because the water is slick and it can be eroded away and crumbling. And of course it can have plants and things which survive on the mist and stuff and the relatively poor rock next to it. So you can have mosses and stuff and carnivorous plants, which are fairly common. Carnivorous plants also occupy bogs and swamps and fens where the soil is sodden and not particularly nutritious. They need to get their nutrition elsewhere, and they will turn to animals to do that. Mostly it's insects, but of course get large enough and there's very little difference between an insect and a person, so plants don't really differentiate. Factories make interesting hazardous encounter areas as well. A blacksmith or a smelter is very much like you can have all sorts of things which, if you don't read the language or don't really know much about factories and things, they can be quite treacherous as well. So that's something to keep in mind. And of course, it may have golems or automata or captured animals or elemental spirits and things like that, which can cause all sorts of problems. I remember in Icewind Dale, there's a town there where one of I think it's a Duergar blacksmith, got involved with summoning fire elemental in order to, or maybe it was mephits, something like that, imps or something, in order to help with the heat needed for the forge. Of course, if you're in a icy area, it may be difficult to get a good regular supply of wood or charcoal for firing these things, and elemental spirits would seem like a logical thing to do, to summon one of them and keep it contained. But of course, if it gets out of hand, it'll burn down your entire town. So, one thing I was going to talk about is ability score loss and things like that. In encounters where you want to get rid of some of the resources of the player characters, but the players are making sure that those characters are taking short rests and long rests frequently, and it's very hard to challenge them outside of putting them against deadly combats over and over again, which can get quite tiresome and stressful and kind of turn you off from the adventure if you know that you're just walking into a wall of monsters that don't seem to make much sense. So throw them all sorts of curveballs in it when it comes to diversions and terrain and things like that, and weather effects and the movement of other creatures and things which maybe you want to avoid. If it's a monster or a fight that they can't possibly win, let them see it at a distance. Don't drop them right in front of it and force them to run away. Put it at a distance where they've actually got like quite a bit of safety, where they can decide either they're going to risk trying to get past that thing and potentially getting into a fight which can kill them all, or they're going to divert quite a distance around it to avoid that encounter entirely. And of course, ability score loss. So if you get smashed up in a cave-in, or a fallen tree has landed on your leg, or you've been squirted by some acid, or something has bitten several of your fingers off, you're looking at quite a serious ongoing injury. So the spells that we have available for a restoration of your ability scores is really, there's only one spell in the game that can do it, which is Greater Restoration. Even recuperating on your downtime between adventures is not a guarantee. So if you recuperate, which means you're taking several days off between adventures, this is not just a long rest, this is an entire day or several days of doing nothing but resting and recuperating from injuries and things. So you use your downtime to recover from injury, disease, or poison. That's the idea. After 3 days of downtime spent recuperating, you make a DC 15 Constitution saving throw, and on a successful save, you can choose to either prevent some effect on you, which is repressing your ability to heal natural hit points. So it could be a curse or some such thing like that. And for the next 24 hours, you gain advantage on saving throws against one disease or a poison currently affecting you. And although it doesn't say so in the rules, it's kind of implicit that if you have some sort of a loss or an injury, such as a strain or a broken limb or something like that, there's a chance that you could recover the ability score loss involved with that broken limb or something like that. It's fuzzy. There's a lot of wiggle room. There's not a lot of solid rules in 5th edition to deal with that sort of thing. So it's so circumstantial. Like, how many ability points do you remove for having both your legs broken? It's going to severely hamper your dexterity and strength, but not necessarily if you're just bench pressing something. If you're a card dealer, you're not going to go anywhere because you're sitting down, but it doesn't really prevent you from doing your job, apart from possibly pain. Lesser Restoration is a second level spell. It's an instant abjuration spell. In fact, all of these restorations are abjuration spells. It doesn't require any special components other than the ability to talk and make gestures, and of course to touch the target. And the creature you touch instantaneously can end a disease or one condition affecting it. So the condition is typically blinded or paralyzed or deafened or poisoned. So it's like instant recuperation. Whereas Greater Restoration is, although it's still instant, it requires 100 gold pieces of diamond dust as a component, which is, I don't know, I find it difficult to get hold of diamond dust, do you? It's going to be pretty, it's not going to be an easy thing to get hold of. It's a level 5 spell as well, so it's kind of restricted knowledge. But once you learn how to cast this, you can just touch somebody and instantly cast it and burn up the diamond dust, and you imbue that creature with positive energy to undo a debilitating effect. So essentially you're channeling celestial power into this individual, and you can reduce the target's exhaustion levels by 1 or end one of the following effects, which include being charmed or petrified, so turned to stone, one curse involving the target's attunement to a magical item or a curse which has been placed on them by a supernatural entity or another spellcaster, and any reduction to one of the target's ability scores. So that's full restoration of that particular ability score, or any of their scores. So any reduction to one of the target's ability scores. So it could be dexterity or strength or constitution or intelligence or whatever. Just not all of them at once. And one effect reducing the target's hit point maximum. So that could be, it doesn't really go into whether that restores a limb or anything like that. That would be, again, more of an aspect of the hit points. So can a supreme healing potion, for instance, reattach a limb? Maybe. It would have to be a particularly good one. Getting limbs lopped off in medieval times with people throwing around swords is far more common than is ever represented in Dungeons and Dragons, and it's never talked about. They're getting their heads chopped off. You get full hit points. All swords, when you think about it, are Vorpal, really. You're going to get your head chopped off if you're playing around with swords as much as your average adventurer in Dungeons and Dragons does. It's going to happen eventually. I've whacked a few people in the side of the neck with fake swords, and often enough to know how commonplace it really would be. And certainly getting limbs particularly your hands and things, your fingers lopped off in sword fights. Even when you don't get a serious injury, there's a chance of somebody getting through your guard and just slicing into your hand, and that's going to severely affect your ability to hold on to anything for weeks, possibly months, possibly forever. So even a relatively minor sword fight could result in you needing to go and get a greater restoration spell to recuperate your ability score loss. So something to keep in mind. Maybe scatter a few more things around your adventure which would restore your ability points and make ability score one of the resources that gets reduced in the adventure a lot more commonly than it currently does, if your adventurers happen to be taking long rests and short rests far more often than normal people would in day-to-day life. So something to keep in mind. Right. That about covers it for a broad stroke sort of look at all the different elements affecting adventurers outside of monsters and encounters with natural effects and supernatural effects and things which can hamper your movement and take more time and resources away from you. Specific traps and things like that I could probably talk about in future talks. I'd also like to talk about some unusual ecologies and unique monsters, as opposed to more commonplace and sort of races of monsters or species of monsters. So that includes hybrid monsters. Well, there's been a lot of interest in hybrid dragons, for instance, and what effect they would have, and how sort of dragons evolved in the game to be divided up into chromatic and metallic and gem and other sort of dragons. And there must be surely quite a lot of dragons which fall between the cracks of those, and how do they really influence things? Also, what are the things that make up dragon society? Like, I've talked about the Dragon Rage mythal no longer being applicable in Forgotten Realms. What about other worlds which never had a Dragon Rage mythal? What suppressed the ability of dragons to take over whole regions and become kings of their domain, sort of thing? Emperors of other civilizations that they've just taken control over. So these are interesting questions and things that I'm certainly looking forward to talking about in these more unscripted chats. As for now, I'm going to get to work on another video. I've got a live chat coming up with you tomorrow, and I'm quite enjoying these little unscripted chats with you and taking notes while I do. And they've absolutely depended on your feedback to me. So if you have some topic that you want me to talk about, this is absolutely, fire the questions at me and I'll answer them as best I can. All right, I'll catch you later.